All right, we are going to get started. All right, this is COVID-19, what we know so far and planning for the future. My name is Dr. Valda Crowder, also known affectionately as Dr. V. I'm an emergency medicine physician, and I've been an emergency medicine physician now for 30 years. And all of these presentations are taped. The Q&A is not taped, so you have privacy when you ask questions. And they're also dated because information is changing very, very rapidly on what we know about this disease, how to treat it, what to look for, all of these things. So this is the presentation for November 24th. All the original source documentations will be at AskDrV.us, and you can also follow me on Twitter at AskDR_V. Okay, the structure is going to be a slide presentation, 10 to 15 minutes. Sometimes it's longer. Today it'll be a little bit longer, maybe 20 minutes, because people were asking for a lot of additional information, and which I have provided in this presentation. Then we open up the lines and we go straight to Q&A. All of us are making decisions in our lives, and I want some place where people can actually ask questions and actually get some real-time answers so it can impact their actual decision making. How to ask questions. Everyone in this presentation is in listen mode. You can either type your questions into the chat icon, or you can also type them into the Q&A. And you can type into both during the presentation, so you don't have to worry about forgetting anything. And then we get started and we start answering the questions. Depending upon how many people are on this, if we have less than 10 to 12, then we can actually open up the lines and people can talk. If we have 20 when this is over, or 25, then sometimes we cannot. So it just really kind of depends. Most of the slides at the very beginning are about sort of current events, and then we go into some basics about COVID-19, and then we end with some things that are new. So let's get ourselves started. The intention of this webinar is for participants to be informed with COVID-19 science that will help them and their families stay healthy throughout the pandemic. All of us have communities, family members, extended family members, and we want everyone to stay healthy and safe. The outcome is that you'll leave this webinar motivated to either create or improve an action plan for yourself or your family. Or you may be motivated to create or improve an action plan for a broader community. Maybe you're dealing with a union or a school or a workplace or a church or something along that lines. All right, so it took us 99 days to reach the first million cases, 43 days to hit the second million case, 28 days to reach the third million case, 4 millionth case was in 2 weeks, 5 million case was in 17 days, and then we reached 6 million and we went from 5 to 6 million in about 22 days. Now, this was a slide that I had in the presentation that was over the summertime. We are now in a different situation. We are now looking at record COVID cases throughout the country, and we're looking at COVID having killed about 250,000 people in total, going to 260. The New York City school system, which is the largest school system in the United States, actually recently closed because the percentage of cases in New York City had begun to creep up again. So as you look here, this is COVID cases over the last 2 days. When I provided that first slide and you're doing 1 million cases in 20 days, that is 70,000 cases a day. We're now getting really, really close. We haven't hit 200,000 cases a day, but we've had on November 20th, we had 187,000. Once you get to 200,000 cases a day, you're actually adding 1 million cases every 5 days, right? So this is really, really spreading like wildfire, which is why I want people to really, really be cautious and get on this webinar, figure out what you need to do for yourself before you catch it, if you catch it, after you catch it, and all of that, right? So they actually predict that we will soon hit 200,000 daily coronavirus cases. In addition to that, we have some states that have moratoriums against utilities being shut off, which are in purple. The red states, actually, and it has nothing to do with political red or blue, but the red states have no moratorium. So in those areas, in the wintertime, people can have their heat shut off or their water shut off or their electric shut off while we are in the midst of a pandemic. If you're traveling, I'm telling people to be very, very careful. Talk to your airlines and call and find out what the procedures are. Southwest Airlines said that they were going to unblock the middle seat starting November 30th. Delta Airlines said they were going to keep the middle seat blocked until March. So if you're flying or you haven't figured out who you want to buy a ticket with, these are things that you actually need to know before you actually make a purchase. And then you do want to actually fly with all of your PPE. All right, so here's what we know. RESPECT, COVID-19, respected, respected, respected. It is highly, highly contagious. When you are around somebody that is infected, it takes only 45 seconds of exposure to become infected. 60 to 80% of the people who are around someone who is positive will become positive. Now, this is very different than the flu, which only maybe 30% of the people become positive, and you have to be around the person with the flu for a much longer period of time. Right? So this was a study that came out after our slide from the CDC. They have a weekly morbidity and mortality report that actually talked about you can catch COVID-19 in less than 1 minute. The other thing is that people often talk about people coughing and sneezing. You can actually catch COVID-19 with regular speaking, right? So that's why it's important, even with regular speaking, that you're 6 feet apart and both people have on a mask. Now, you've seen some things about mouthwash can kill the virus in a lab. I remind people this is in a lab, right? So in your body where the virus is replicating, it's actually not going to stop the replication. Mouthwash is not going to stop the replication of a virus, okay? So if it kills it momentarily on the surface, your body, when you're infected, is actually replicating and making more and more virus. So please don't get thrown off by these types of things that you see on TV. All right, so now COVID-19 is both a droplet and an airborne disease. Droplet are drops that are bigger than 5 microns. They're big, they're heavy, and they fall 3 feet from the person. Example is pertussis, mumps, and COVID-19. Airborne are smaller particles. They're less than 5 microns, and they can go a lot further than 5 feet. So think tuberculosis, measles, and also COVID-19. So here's a picture of somebody who is positive. They're coughing or speaking or singing or sneezing or whatever they're doing. And the red is the droplets and the gray is the airborne. So you see how both are actually spread. And in COVID-19, again, it is actually both spread through the red as well as through the gray. Now, one of the things that is important is with singing or sneezing or playing instruments, these particles then fly at much, much higher speeds. So for instance, someone singing or sneezing, these particles are going at about 200 miles per hour, right? So this is why things like church and concerts and things like that are very important and are canceled. All right, so now, I want to show this video. This is very, very important for the holidays. I know some people are going to take some risky behavior and have some people over, or maybe not too many people, but I want to actually show how opening windows and increasing ventilation can actually help you. So this is a video and it is in Japanese, so you're going to need to read the subtitles, but it's also visual.
新型コロナウイルスの新たな感染経路として注目されているマイクロ飛沫。こちら、くしゃみを高感度カメラで撮影した映像。キラキラと漂うのがマイクロ飛沫です。100分の1ミリ以下と小さく軽いため、漂い続けるのが特徴。
バナナボートとか乗ったら楽しいですよ。いや、絶対楽しい、ね。めちゃくちゃ楽しい。
大きな声で会話をした時にもマイクロ飛沫は発生します。
近くの人、その人が吸い込むことによって感染が広がる、そういったリスクが見えてきたものと思います。
そのリスクを防ぐために効果的と考えられているのが換気。窓を大きく開け空気の流れを作るとマイクロ飛沫は排出することができるのです。
All righty. So I wanted to just show you that. So I tell people, please, this winter, open your windows and waste your heat. Okay. It's very, very, very important if you're actually going to have anybody over to your house, which I wouldn't recommend, that you don't normally quarantine with. Okay. Or if you're going to a restaurant, you don't want to be cooped up inside a restaurant and they don't have the windows and doors open. I was at a restaurant that I enjoy. It was a little bit colder than normal. And they had a tent set up with sides on it with no windows, and I had them open up the front door, and it made a huge difference. Okay, so if you happen to see yourself at a party or at dinner or something with someone that you normally don't socialize with, or who you're not quarantining with, and you're taking a risk, open the windows. Okay. All right, so now how do I know if myself or my family has COVID? All right, there's 3 types of tests. There's a PCR test, an antigen test, and a CAT scan and CAT scan findings. So let's go over them. So a PCR test is normally done by a medical professional. This is not something that you do at home. It has to be where the swab actually goes very, very high up in your nose. It's very, very uncomfortable. It is most accurate 8 days after exposure. It can be inaccurate if it's administered too soon or too late. So that's the PCR test. The antigen test is what we call home test, do-it-yourself test, rapid test. This test actually detects proteins on the surface of the particle. The problem with this is it will tell you 20 to 30% of the time that you do not have COVID when you do. So this is really, really, really important. If the test is positive, it's very accurate. If it's negative, you may need another one. So when someone has a rapid test or do-it-yourself test, we actually recommend that they actually get 2 tests separated by 24 hours. And if they get 2 tests separated by 24 hours and they're both negative, then we call that a true negative. Now, some people, the tests are negative and they're having all the symptoms. And then what happens is we get a CAT scan of their chest. If you look in the second row, where it looks like you're looking at someone's chest straight on, they're little yellow arrows. It's very small, very slight to the naked eye, but this is increased opacifications in both lungs that you don't normally see on a CAT scan. And these bilateral sort of ground glass opacifications are actually are diagnostic for coronavirus. All right, so let's talk about 6 clusters. Now this talks about the 6 clusters. I actually say there's 7, because the first cluster that nobody talks about a lot is you can be completely asymptomatic and actually have COVID and spread COVID. So outside of being completely asymptomatic, here are the other ones. The earliest sign is always loss of smell or loss of taste for all of these clusters. So cluster 1 is flu-like symptoms with no fever. Cluster 2 is flu-like symptoms with a fever. Cluster 3 actually is only gastrointestinal. You might think that maybe you have a stomach flu. You might have vomiting and diarrhea like you ate something bad. You may or may not have sore throat, chest pain, or cough. Now, so 1, 2, and 3, normally you can actually be at home and do fine with those. Cluster 4, 5, and 6 are the ones that actually have to be hospitalized, wind up in the ICU, or pass. So cluster 4 is flu-like symptoms with fatigue. Cluster 5, you have confusion, and with cluster 6, you have all the symptoms together: fatigue, confusion, abdominal pain, etc. Okay. So now what's important to know about these clusters is that some people are going to have some of the symptoms. They may not have all of the symptoms, but you kind of get the general flavor. Once you actually begin to get fatigue, shortness of breath, and confusion, you are definitely in a more serious cluster of COVID-19. Now, how does COVID replicate in your body? So this is the virus here in orange, and the viral material is kind of reddish orange, and then the viral material is yellowish orange. And the purple is your cell. So there's a receptor, it hits that receptor, and that's how it enters into your body. Once it gets in there, the orange RNA actually gets converted into proteins, and then it makes copy after copy after copy. And as it makes more copies, then you have a new virus, it exits the cell, and it goes, infects another cell. So a lot of the things that we've seen about certain people doing better depending upon their blood type, we think is related, somehow related to entry into the cells, right? So people with a blood type O do better, and people with blood type A are more likely to not do well with this disease. So one of the medications that you hear people talk about is remdesivir, and that is a medication that blocks the replication of the virus inside the cell. All right, so I just found out I was COVID positive. What do I do? You want to quarantine immediately. Some people will say 10 to 14 days, preferably 21. We found in a study that about 6 to 10% of the people still were shedding virus after 14 days. If you want to really be for sure, either get tested and get 2 rapid tests or 1 PCR test, or actually just quarantine for the full 21 days. All right, now, what do you need to have in a quarantine room? So to the right there, I'm showing you a pulse ox. That pulse ox actually shows what's called SpO2, which is your hemoglobin saturation. In the picture that you see there to the right, it's 97, that's 97%. Most people, if you're young and healthy and you're not a smoker, your normal saturation will be 95% or above. If it's less than 95%, you need to go to the emergency department. If you're a smoker or you're older, then, I would say, if it's below 93% or so, you want to make sure everybody should be taking zinc and vitamin D3. Everybody, whether or not you're COVID positive during this pandemic, should be taking zinc and vitamin D3 supplements right now. The other thing that you should do right now, let me get back to the quarantine room, but the other thing that you should be doing right now is get your flu shot. And that's because some people are going to get COVID and the flu and not do well. But for your quarantine room, you want to have a pulse ox, zinc, vitamin D3. You want to have an access to a bathroom that will only be used by you, cell phone, have people leave food at a closed door, open the windows, and also a HEPA filter, right? And again, opening the windows and the HEPA filter, you'll be more likely not to give it to somebody else that is in the house. They found that 80% of the people with COVID-19 were vitamin D deficient, right? And so vitamin D deficiency, if you live in a sunny area, if you go walking 30 minutes 3 times a day, you're probably not vitamin D deficient. But if you live in a cold area, you live in, Illinois or Michigan or New Hampshire or Maine, where there's not as much sun, you may be vitamin D deficient. So it's very, very important to actually take the vitamin D as well as the zinc. All right, so now if you are COVID positive, you should use the pulse ox and check your pulse ox a couple times a day. Again, less than 95% and you're healthy, go on into the emergency department. The reason why you have to check your pulse ox is with COVID-19, people don't know they're short of breath. They actually feel good. We call them happy hypoxics, right? And what happens is if they don't know they're short of breath, then they're more likely to die at home or die in their sleep. So it's very, very important that you check your pulse ox, because this is not a disease where you won't necessarily feel sick or feel short of breath, and then suddenly you feel fine, and then suddenly you wind up in the ICU. All right, vitamin D, zinc, famotidine, which I'll talk about, Decadron, remdesivir, and Regeneron. Regeneron is not the name of the medication, it's the name of the company, but you hear referred to that in the news. So I'm going to refer to it as that because the medication has not been given a name yet. So let's go through this. We already talked about zinc and vitamin D3. Famotidine, what is famotidine? Famotidine is a complicated name for just Pepcid AC. Now, a lot of people say, well, why do I take Pepcid AC? Because Pepcid AC blocks histamine release. So think about when you have an allergic reaction, you get stung by a bee, you ate something you shouldn't eat, maybe you have a peanut allergy. All of that bloating and inflammation and redness is histamine, right? So we have found that if you actually take Pepsid AC, which you can buy in the drugstore, it is associated with a lower hospital death rate, and is also associated with you being less likely to be put on a ventilator by about 30%. Other things is dexamethasone. Now this you cannot get at home. This has to be through a doctor and you're normally hospitalized. So this is a steroid. So if you have anybody who's hospitalized, you want to make sure that they're getting dexamethasone, also known as Decadron. It lowers the 28-day death rate for patients that require oxygen or on a ventilator. Remdesivir. Remdesivir is the medication that I showed you in the picture. It stops the replication of the virus. It's a antiviral medication. It seems to get people off the ventilator maybe a day or two earlier. We haven't necessarily seen increased long-term survival, but it does seem to get people out of the ICU a little bit earlier. Okay, Regeneron. Regeneron is the name of the company. Again, they have an antibody cocktail. There are two antibodies. One that comes from a human that has recovered from COVID-19, and the other one comes from a mouse engineered to have a human-like immune system. And Regeneron is an antibody cocktail, which I think they just recently applied for FDA approval. Eli Lilly also has a antibody treatment. It actually got emergency FDA approval on November 10th. So on November 10th, Eli Lilly's antibody treatment actually got emergency FDA approval. So this should be available and in use in the hospital. Now, as I said to people, you can catch COVID-19 a second time. So don't think that because you got it, that means, oh, I don't need to wear a mask. I don't need to do anything. That's not true. We've seen several cases of COVID-19 being caught more than once in Asia. A Nevada man who was 25 caught COVID-19 for a second time. The second case was actually worse than the first. There was a study in Britain that actually showed the antibodies decreasing over 3 months. There was a 26% decline in antibodies over 3 months. And as you went out to 6, 12, 18, and 24 months, the antibodies continued to actually decrease in concentration, and people were susceptible to getting COVID-19 a second time. All right, so now let's talk about vaccines, because there's been a lot of stuff about vaccines. How many doses do we need? How effective is it? What are the side effects? How are they going to distribute it? Where's the peer-reviewed data? All of these things. So let's first talk about and none of them actually have a name, so that's why I'm calling them by the name of the company. So the Pfizer vaccine, it's 2 doses. You get 1 dose and then another dose a month later. 92% effective. It is associated with soreness and fatigue. Some people had to take a day or 2 off. It requires cold storage at -75 degrees. So it requires being stored in liquid nitrogen. We do not have peer-reviewed data that has been published as of yet, but the data has been provided to NIH. Moderna, also 2 doses, 1 dose and then another dose a month later, 95% effective, muscle aches and severe fatigue. Now this one requires cold storage at -20 degrees, which is more like a freezer. The results have been sent over to NIH, but nothing peer-reviewed that is actually in the publications as of yet. Now, this is very, very, very important because a lot of people don't understand how the vaccines actually work. So these vaccines are going to prevent you from getting sick. They won't necessarily prevent you from actually transmitting the virus. So if you get in contact with the virus, you will get infected by the virus, but you will not get sick. But you could give the virus to someone else. So masks are still going to be needed until everyone gets vaccinated, and this is really actually eliminated. All right, so let's talk about what happened in the United States. Some critical dates. On January 12th, China actually released the genomic sequence for COVID-19 publicly to all countries and to the world on January 12th. January 15th was the first diagnosed case in the United States. January 28th, the CDC announced COVID-19 testing. On February 13th, the CDC realized that the test did not work that they put together. On February 29th, we had the first US death was on February 29th. I'm like, wow, it just almost seemed like years ago. On March 13th, we had declared a state of an emergency. So one of the things that we're now noticing going back on medical records and also going back into the database on billing is that we're seeing increased respiratory illnesses that are resistant to standard treatment as early as December. So it's probable that COVID-19 was actually here in December. Now, this actually shows COVID-19 case and death rate by country. I've circled the United States. Now, what is important, because a lot of people say, well, there's more cases because we're a bigger country, we have more people. So whenever we do this sort of data, we always standardize it for population, and we do deaths per 100,000. And as you can see there, the United States is at 72.82. And if you actually look, there's a lot of countries that are less than us. So if you actually look through here, Germany is at 13 per 100,000. Poland is at 21 per 100,000. Austria is at 16 per 100,000. Canada is at 28 per 100,000, right? Even countries like Honduras, 28 per 100,000. So as you can see, there's a lot of countries that have done better than us. So let's talk about what does that look like? So United States, because everybody's been asking me about Australia. And I said I would get the information about Australia. So United States has a population of 328 million. Australia has a population of 26 million. So basically we're 10 times as big as Australia. As of early November, in the United States, or mid-November, we had 85,000 patients hospitalized with COVID. Australia had 18. We had 8,834 patients in the ICU. Australia had 1, right? In addition, Melbourne, which is the capital to Australia, has had no new cases of COVID-19 since October 13th. Now, this is very interesting because people go, well, wow, I mean, how did they get those results? And that's what I've been asked a lot, and I'm going to actually show it a little bit to you here tonight. So let's talk about what Australia did. February 1st, Australia closed its borders to China. On March 13th, they closed its borders to all other countries. On March 22nd, Australia as a country closed bars, clubs, cinemas, gyms, churches indefinitely. They have not reopened since March 22nd. Now, what they did with restaurants was restaurants and cafes are takeout only. The end of March, they limited social gatherings to no more than 2 people. They did widespread testing, and specifically what they did was they tested healthcare workers, nursing home workers, prison workers, prisoners were all tested regularly. Any Australian citizen with even the mildest symptom, even a sniffle, was tested. May 4th, Australia tested asymptomatic people. So you don't have to have any symptoms, and Australia started testing. Now, Australia has several what they call public health care acts. And these are laws that require, if there's something that is going on that is a public health emergency, that requires citizens to change their behavior, you're required to actually follow the public health rules, and if not, there are penalties. So failure to comply with a public health order, you can be fined $5,500 to $11,000. Failure to comply in providing false information or misleading information is $11,000. I have an extra zero there, sorry about that. And 6 months minimum in prison. Now, let's say you're engaging in conduct that would actually cause a serious public health risk, like you're going into places without a mask and you're throwing a party and you're decide to have a huge wedding or a huge funeral or whatever. That's a $50,000 fine or 1 year in prison. So as you can see, they have much more accountability with their public health measures. Now, I had a lot of questions about UV light and UV light killing germs. So what's important to know is UV light can be dangerous to human tissue, and it can also kill viruses and germs. And this is why I didn't want to actually give the information out without actually knowing the wavelength. So when you say what amount of UV light or what wavelength kills the viruses but does not harm human tissue, it's a wavelength of 222. So that is the UV light. And at that wavelength, UV light will kill coronavirus, influenza, and other viruses, SARS, etc. I also have been getting asked a lot of questions about air purifiers. And how do I know which air purifier to purchase? So a couple of things. One is you want to find an ozone-free air purifier. If you're in California, you have to actually use an ozone-free one. But to help with the environment, we want an ozone-free air purifier. We don't want to create ozone while we're purifying our air. They have filters. And the filters will either go down to 0.3 microns or 0.1 microns. Going down to 0.1 microns is a hospital grade air purifier. I got a hospital grade air purifier on Amazon for $70. Okay, so just because it's hospital grade doesn't necessarily mean that it's too expensive. Noisy. You want to know how noisy it is, how many decibels, does it have a sleep mode, does it have an indicator that tells you needs a new filter, how much is the new filter? Some of them, the filters are actually more expensive than the actual air purifier. And then how large or small of a room do they actually purify? So these are all the things that you want to actually look for. Alrighty, this is what I'm going to actually be reading up on over the Thanksgiving holiday. We will not be having this presentation on Thanksgiving, so we will restart on Tuesday, and by that time I will have gone through all of the data and all the original source documentation for this particular article. And I've had a lot of questions about mutations, and it looks like there is evidence for some early mutations that may have made this pandemic a little bit harder to stop. So I will actually get to the bottom of this over Thanksgiving while I'm eating turkey with the same people that I live with and nobody else. And then this will be added to the presentation for next week.